Hello students, welcome to Raj Malhotra's IAS Academy. I'm Surbhi Sardana and today we are taking a very important discussion regarding India's nationally determined contributions, the updated ones, and meeting India's carbon sink targets. Not only this, we'll utilize this discussion to study all the issues that surround India's nationally determined contributions. तो issues क्या हैं, nationally determined contributions क्या हैं, COP21 के हमारे टारगेट्स क्या हैं, पेरिस अग्रीमेंट क्या है और ये जो कार्बन सिंक टारगेट्स का इशू है ये क्या है. एवरीथिंग, ऑल ऑफ दीज इश्यूज, ऑल ऑफ दीज टॉपिक्स विल बी स्टडीड अंडर these heads. So yes, let's look at the index. First of all, we'll study what is a carbon sink. Then we'll also go back to UNFCCC COP21 or the Paris Agreement. Knowing the details of Paris Agreement is very important for your prelims as well as mains point of view. So we'll briefly look at major terms and main provisions of the Paris Agreement. Then we'll also look at updated nationally determined contributions of India, which are known as updated NDCs. Then we'll also look at Panchamrit Strategy of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which was announced by him at COP26. Discussions surrounding NDCs, that would be our fifth topic of discussion. There are a lot of debates going on around India's NDCs, whether these are apt, how they will be met, have they already been achieved, and a lot more. And how is India meeting its carbon sink targets? That is the main focus of our discussion today. So let's move ahead. Let's look at what a carbon sink is. एक carbon sink होता क्या है? So I want you to look at this diagram. See, there are carbon producing sources and there are carbon absorbing sources. So if you look at this diagram very closely, you will see that basically this is water or this is ocean and there are trees and soil. These three things, your oceans, forest and soil, these three actually absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So what happens is, if there is a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, अगर atmosphere में carbon dioxide बहुत ज़्यादा है, that is a greenhouse gas, it actually leads to global warming. Global warming ज़्यादा होती है. So what we want is, we want to create more and more carbon sinks. And what are these carbon sinks? Your oceans, they are the biggest carbon sinks. Oceans सिर्फ carbon absorb ही नहीं करते, वो oxygen भी produce करते हैं. The second one is forest and the third one is soil. So basically a carbon sink is something that absorbs more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than it actually releases. So carbon sink, it removes greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, either by destroying them chemically or by storing them in some other form so that they are not present in the atmosphere, and hence climate change actually slows down, global warming slows down. So that is the concept of carbon sink, and our topic for today's discussion is that how is India meeting its carbon sink targets. कार्बन सिंक बनाने के टारगेट्स हमने COP21 पेरिस अग्रीमेंट के अंडर, हमने UNFCCC के अंडर हमने we have given those targets on an international level, and how are we achieving them. For the first thing, you need to understand carbon sink. That part is done. Now let's see what is the Paris Agreement and why there is so much discussion around the Paris Agreement. Basically ये एक लीगली बाइंडिंग इंटरनेशनल ट्रीटी है ऑन क्लाइमेट चेंज. पेरिस अग्रीमेंट इज़ अ लीगली बाइंडिंग इंटरनेशनल ट्रीटी ऑन क्लाइमेट चेंज. अ लॉट ऑफ टाइम्स UPSC does ask you questions in prelims whether a particular treaty is legally binding or not. So yes, Paris Agreement is legally binding, but there is a catch to it. What is it? We'll see in a while. So yes, it was adopted by 196 parties at United Nations Climate Change Conference in 2015, जो कि पेरिस में हुई थी, and it entered into force in November 2016. So basically Paris Agreement का गोल क्या है? What is the goal of Paris Agreement? It is to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Industrialization या industrial revolution आने से पहले जो हमारे अर्थ के टेम्परेचर्स होते थे, उससे 2 डिग्री सेल्सियस की रेंज में अपने टेम्परेचर मेंटेन करना है. इफ़ यू गो बियॉन्ड दैट, देन ग्लोबल वार्मिंग वुड बी वेरी हाई. सो अ लॉट ऑफ एक्सपर्ट्स से दैट you should not hold them up to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, but you have to limit them to just 1.5 degrees Celsius to प्री इंडस्ट्रियल लेवल्स, अगर प्री इंडस्ट्रियल लेवल्स में आपका टेम्परेचर यहाँ तक था तो आप सिर्फ 2 डिग्री सेल्सियस ही ऊपर जा सकते हैं टू हैव योर गुड क्वालिटी सर्वाइवल. बट नाउ अ लॉट ऑफ एक्सपर्ट्स आर सेइंग दैट ब्रिंग दिस टारगेट टू 1.5 डिग्री सेल्सियस ओनली. इससे ऊपर आप टेम्परेचर इंक्रीज मत होने दीजिए अर्थ का या ग्लोब का. डू नॉट लेट टेम्परेचर्स गो बियॉन्ड 1.5 डिग्री सेल्सियस दैट वाज एग्जिस्टिंग in your pre-industrial levels. So however, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade or Celsius, greenhouse gas emissions must peak before 2025 at the latest and decline 43% by 2030. So yes, greenhouse gas emissions, they are basically increasing because level of development is increasing. So they say jitna bhi greenhouse gas emissions increase hone hain, whatever is the increase in intensity of greenhouse gas emissions, it should peak, it should reach a maximum point by 2025 and not beyond that. In fact, it should decline by 43% by 2030. So yes, how does the Paris Climate Agreement achieve this? Paris Climate Agreement के ऐसे कौन से provisions हैं जो हमें 1.5 डिग्री सेल्सियस टारगेट अचीव करने में हेल्प करते हैं? So the first one is your net zero emissions. The second one is enhance resilience and adaptation to climate impacts certain to occur. And thirdly, align financial flows in the world with these objectives. So first of all, आपका net zero emissions का जो target है, basically here they are motivating countries. ये countries को motivate कर रहे हैं कि जितना आप carbon dioxide या greenhouse gas emissions produce कर रहे हैं उतना आप absorb भी करें, create more carbon sinks in your countries. The second one is enhance resilience and adaptation to climate impacts certain to occur. जो आपके increase in temperature, इंक्रीज इन ग्लोबल वार्मिंग से जो आपके hazardous circumstances क्रिएट होने वाले हैं, इंक्रीजिंग रेजिलियंस टू दैट. एंड थर्डली, aligned financial flows in the world with these objectives. For example, in the coming times, if new corporates are being set up, नई companies बन रही हैं, नई टाइप की डेवलपमेंट हो रही है, नई टाइप की टेक्नोलॉजी आ रही है, so that technology it should not mess up with the climatic targets. In fact, it should fall in alignment with our climatic targets, that is your Paris Agreement. Now the next question is, how does the Paris Agreement work? Paris Agreement काम कैसे करता है? So yes, the Paris Agreement, it works on a 5-year cycle. 5-year cycle means every 5 years countries have to update their goals. Countries अपनी मर्जी से कुछ ना कुछ goals present करेंगी under Paris Agreement. That these, and what will these goals entail? These goals will talk about what these countries will take steps. ऐसे कौन से steps होंगे जो ये countries लेंगी climate change को control करने के लिए. So the Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action or ratcheting up carried out by countries. So ये 5-year goals हैं, and these goals, these are known as nationally determined contributions, and these have to be updated after every 5 years. The next one is, so yes, your Paris Agreement, it came into force in 2016. 2015 mein it was open for signature. In 2016 it entered into force. So 5 years from that time, now the first NDCs, they were supplied, they were given under the Paris Agreement by all the countries in 2015 or 2016. 2015 या 2016 में countries ने अपने NDCs दे दिए थे. इंडिया ने अपना जो first NDC की list दी थी, nationally determined contributions, that was back in 2015. Now in 2020, 5 years actually got covered. So starting from 2020, since 2020, countries have been submitting their national climate action plans known as nationally determined contributions. Each successive NDC, it is meant to reflect an increasingly higher degree of ambition compared to the previous version. So let's say in 2015, India का target यहाँ पर था. The next target has to be higher, that your carbon sinks have to increase, your greenhouse gas emissions have to decrease. Your next NDC, that is nationally determined contribution, in the next 5 years, it cannot be lower than the previous NDC or previous targets. So that's how it works. Now talking about what are NDCs? Talking about NDCs in detail, or nationally determined contributions in detail. Now in their NDCs, countries communicate actions that they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emission in order to reach the goals of Paris Agreement, and these have to be written actions. They cannot be delivered on a vocal basis. एक written document आपको submit करना पड़ता है, and these are basically since Paris Agreement is legally binding, so these targets they have to be reached. Countries also communicate in their NDCs actions they will take to build resilience. ना कि सिर्फ ग्रीन हाउस गैस एमिशंस को रिड्यूस करने के लिए, नॉट जस्ट टू रिड्यूस द ग्रीन हाउस गैस एमिशंस बट टू ऑल्सो इंक्रीज द रेजिलियंस टू अडेप्ट टू द इम्पैक्ट्स ऑफ क्लाइमेट चेंज. दैट विल ऑल्सो बी सीन. And the second one here is how the Paris Agreement is functioning. The first one was the NDCs or nationally determined contributions, and these are compulsory. But the second one here is your long-term strategies. Long-term strategies means in the next 40 years, 50 years, what is your plan of action? What do you aim to achieve? So long-term strategies, to better frame the efforts towards long-term goal, the Paris Agreement invites countries to formulate and submit long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, commonly known as LEDs or LTLEDs. So these provide the long-term horizon to the NDCs. Basically, let's say our long-term strategy of India is basically aim towards 2070. 2070 का जो हमने टारगेट अनाउंस किया है, that is net zero. That whatever carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions, clarity is required there. Whatever level of greenhouse gas emissions India will be producing, India will also be absorbing that, creating carbon sinks, or developing new methods so that carbon of that level, carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases of that level are actually absorbed and they do not cause further global warming. So these are your long-term strategies. The difference here is that your NDCs, they are binding, they are compulsory. जबकि जो first हमने nationally determined contribution study किया है, these are compulsory, while your long-term strategies as of now they are not compulsory. So let's read out the last point. Unlike NDCs, they are not mandatory. Nevertheless, they place the NDCs into the context of countries' long-term planning and development priorities, providing a vision and direction for future development. So whatever companies the country will be inviting, whatever development will start happening in your country. For example, now we have, we are aiming for green hydrogen, we are aiming for electric vehicles. So why are we doing that? Because our long-term strategies, they are basically to convert India into a country with net zero emissions. Also we have our NDCs in place. तो जितना भी development हो रहा है, upcoming of a lot of solar power plants, rooftop solars, upcoming of nuclear power plants for that matter. Why is it all this happening? Because we have commitments to the Paris Agreement. So when your commitments are clear on the public basis, all your companies, all the contracts and all the development that is taking place in the country, they know that India wants lesser emissions and more development. So the basic question that appears here is, and a lot of questions can be framed here, how is the progress tracked? Paris Agreement के अंडर जो progress हो रही है उसकी tracking कैसे की जाती है? So as of now, legally tracking has not begun, but there is this enhanced transparency framework, ETF. UPSC has already asked a question regarding ETF in one of the previous year prelims papers. So focus on this. With the Paris Agreement, countries established an enhanced transparency framework, and this will start functioning in 2024. Under this enhanced transparency framework, countries will report transparently on actions taken and progress in climate change mitigation, adaptation measures and support provided or received. So basically all the details regarding development, regarding funding, regarding climate change mitigation, they will have to be communicated under this enhanced transparency framework. How this will help? This will help countries to learn from each other. Also, it will serve as a system of checks and balances. So it also provides for international procedures for the review of the submitted reports. The information gathered through this ETF transparency framework will feed into the global stocktake, which will assess the collective progress towards the long-term climate goals. This will lead to recommendations for countries to set more ambitious plans, in the next round. So that is every round it happens after 5 years. After every 5 years your previous NDCs were given to your given to these authorities. So what is the Paris Agreement? Basically this is something that is very clear, but here is a catch. I told you that Paris Agreement is legally binding. So the Paris Agreement, it is a landmark in the multilateral climate change process, because for the first time a binding agreement brings all the nations together to combat climate change and adapt to its effects. But yet the treaty, it has a few legal teeth. Legally there is no separate authority to look after whether countries are following their targets or are they on their targets. So it does not impose penalties. There is no fees or embargoes imposed for parties that violate its terms, and there is no international court or governing body ready to enforce compliance. So if you do not have an international body, अगर आपके पास एक international body नहीं है जो कि NDCs को enforce करवा सके, या आप कोई fees या कोई penalties introduce नहीं कर रहे, then what is the guarantee that these countries will follow their targets? ऐसी क्या guarantee है, ऐसा कौन सा check mechanism है कि countries targets पर रहेंगी, targets को follow करेंगी? That has prompted some prominent experts to argue that Paris Accord is not a legally binding document after all. But if you go to the website of COP21 and Paris Agreement, they say that yes, Paris Agreement is legally binding. So that's the information you have to remember. This part is basically for your mains examination. There you will have to have views in your interview, and your mains part you will have to have a lot of views. So that is your viewpoint that is coming here. India and the Paris Agreement. Now coming to the most important part of the discussion, that how is India related to Paris Agreement? हमने अपने कितने हमारे कौन से targets हैं, कितने targets हैं, what are these targets, how many targets does India have, and what are updated nationally determined contributions of India, and what are the discussions surrounding them. So basically India submitted its first NDC to UNFCCC in October 2015. So once it came into operation in 2016, before that itself India gave its first NDCs. So 2015 NDC, they comprised 8 goals. India ने 8 goals दिए थे, and 3 of which were quantitative targets. मतलब आप उनको measure कर सकते हैं, आप उनको level of greenhouse gases कितना emit हो रहा है, कितना आपका tree cover है, कितना forest cover है. This all could be measured and this could be proved. So 3 goals out of 8 goals, they were quantitative targets to be achieved by 2030. And these 3 targets, there were a total of 8, but 3 quantitative targets, they included that cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel sources, to reach 40%. That out of the entire installed capacity that India has for production of electric power, not the other kinds of power, but for electric power only, 40% of electric power should be coming from your non-fossil sources. Now here is the catch, this is just installed capacity we are talking about. We are not talking about exactly electric generation, where is it coming from. So you could have a solar power plant that is installed, but it is not generating electricity. So yes, installed capacity ka target hai, it is not about electricity generation. Now the second one is reduction in the emissions intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% compared to 2005 levels. So see, this is the point where a lot of students find a problem. We will discuss this in detail कि emission intensity क्या होता है, emission intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% compared to 2005 levels. So just remember, emission intensity, GDP, this data 33 to 35% ये अब update किया जा चुका है, and 2005 levels. We'll come back to this. Let's look at the third quantitative target that was there. That was creation of additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forest and tree cover. As I told you, carbon sinks, forest and trees, they serve as carbon sinks. So if you have forest cover or tree cover, then you will have carbon sink. So additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forest and tree cover. So Article 4 of Paris Agreement provides that each party should communicate or update its NDCs every 5 years. This is something that we have discussed. And last year, see, we gave our first NDCs to UNFCCC in 2015. So starting from there, add 5 years, we'll come to 2020. So here India should have given its nationally determined contributions part 2. But here, because of the pandemic, we could not update our targets. We could not plan how can we approach in the coming years because GDP was suffering. We were under a health emergency. There was this pandemic that had grappled the world. So now in August 2022, that is 2 years late from this 2020 target, we have given our NDCs too, that is your updated nationally determined contributions. So what are these contributions? Let's see. So yes, this is a snapshot from PIB. This is from 3rd August and 3rd August of 2022. So yes, here basically the cabinet updated, the cabinet part updated on PIB, that cabinet approves India's updated nationally determined contribution to be communicated to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This was the news. The approval translates Prime Minister Panchamrit announced at COP26 into enhanced climate targets. जब आपका COP21 पेरिस में हुआ है, आपका COP26 कहाँ हुआ है? It happened in Glasgow. So COP26 में your Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he gave a Panchamrit strategy to deal with climate change. There were 5 steps that were announced that India will be taking as part of Panchamrit strategy, और उन्हीं 5 steps को compile करके आपके updated nationally determined contributions बनाए गए हैं. So Panchamrit strategy, basically it happened at COP26. Now a step towards achieving India's long-term goal of reaching net zero by 2070. These long-term goals, they are not mandatory, but yes, India announced its net zero target of by 2070. India now stands committed to reduce emission intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030. In the previous slide we saw that our previous NDC said that we'll reduce emission intensity of GDP by 33 to 35%. Now that has been updated to 45% by 2030. So Prime Minister's concept of mass movement for lifestyle for environment, as a key to combating climate change, that we should have a lifestyle that actually combats climate change. Now we'll discuss all of these NDCs in detail, and we'll also see what are the issues involved, what are the discussions surrounding them. So India's updated NDCs, see here your quantitative targets, they are of more importance as compared to the qualitative ones. So let's look at all of these targets in detail. First of all, to put forward and further propagate a healthy and sustainable way of living, that is your life movement, lifestyle for environment, that is your healthy and sustainable way of living based on traditions and values of conservation and moderation, including through a mass movement. So bringing traditions, values of conservation and moderation that have been a part of Indian culture, they have been, they have been launched on a mass level. That is your life movement, lifestyle for environment, and this would be a key to combating climate change. That is our first updated NDC. The second one is to adopt a climate friendly and cleaner path than the one followed hitherto by others at the corresponding level of economic development. That if there are other developing countries with almost the same level of GDP as India, then India would basically, what we would do in comparison to those other countries, we would adopt a climate friendly and cleaner path. Then you have to reduce the emission intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030 from the 2005 levels. This is a very important one. I'll explain this in a while. And this is the first quantitative target that we have. These two, basically, these are qualitative targets. So the second or the fourth target here and the second quantitative target here is to achieve about 50% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel based energy resources by 2030. In the previous NDCs, this was limited to 40%. This cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel based energy resources, that was limited to 40%. Now it has been increased to 50%. Again, this is not the electricity generated, it is just the installed capacity that we are talking about here. So make sure that you do not confuse yourself. So yes, with the help of transfer of technology and low cost finance, including the Green Climate Fund. Now here is a catch to it, that we will be developing this technology. 50% installed capacity would be from non-fossil fuel sources only if we are provided with the latest technology. For example, if we are given the latest technology to produce electric vehicles or the latest solar panels, and we are provided adequate funding, especially from the Green Climate Fund that was established in your in the framework of UNFCCC itself. And here your developed countries, which actually caused a lot of environment pollution, they are supposed to make contributions on an annual basis, but they have not done it yet. So here is a catch, that India will attain these targets only when we get funding and we get the required latest technology. Then to the third quantitative target and the fifth fifth actual target is to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forest and tree cover by 2030. Now this is where the discussion of this video erupts from. This target, it has not been updated. And as I told you, that your nationally determined contributions after every 5 years, they need to be better than before, they need to increase than before. So in terms of two other quantitative targets, here we took it to 50% in the this one, and here we increased our 33 to 35% limit to 45%. But here when it comes to increasing carbon sink, your target has not been updated. It is again the same, 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent carbon sink would be created so that your carbon dioxide can be absorbed. Now we'll come back to this, because here is where the issue lies. These three quantitative targets, we'll discuss them in detail. Let's focus on the other targets that are here. The next one is to better adapt to climate change, that is a part of Paris Agreement, by enhancing investments in development programs in sectors vulnerable to climate change. Particularly, which are these sectors which are vulnerable to climate change? Your agriculture, water resources, your rivers are drying up, there are areas where floods are coming up. The Himalayan region, very fragile ecosystem, we have seen that in the case of Joshimath disaster. Coastal regions, because inundation is a problem there, increasing cyclones is a problem there. And health and disaster management, because after the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that global warming can induce more and more pandemics. And disaster management, it goes without saying that if you have more global warming, you will have more and more disasters. So better adaptation capabilities will be developed in all these sectors. Then seventh one, to mobilize domestic and new and additional funds from developed countries. Again and again we are asking for funds to implement the above mitigation and adaptation actions in view of the resource required and the resource gap. And the final one is to build capacity and create a domestic framework and international architecture for quick diffusion of cutting edge climate technology in India, and for joint collaborative research and development for such future technologies. So now I'll come back to the quantitative targets, and let's see what are the discussions involved. Before that, this is a snapshot of Panchamrit Strategy that was given by our Prime Minister at COP26. So all your targets that we have discussed here. So non-fossil energy capacity, bringing it to 500 gigawatt by 2030, or 50% of its energy requirement that would be from non-fossil sources. Then India will cut down its net projected carbon emission by 1 billion ton. That is a part of your GDP target, 45%. And this is again your India will bring down the carbon intensity of its economy by more than 45% by 2030, and India will achieve the target of net zero by 2070. These 5 targets, these were known as Panchamrit Strategy of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So now what are the basically India already says that when we are talking about installed capacity, that 50% of installed capacity of the country would be from non-fossil sources. This is the data that Economic Survey has given us. Economic Survey says that in terms of transition to renewable energy sources, India has already achieved its 40% target. So this 40% target, it has been achieved by 2022 itself. So now by 2030 we can move on to achieving 50% installed capacity, or electric power installed capacity to 50% can be increased by 2030. So it has advanced the target to 50%, which will also translate to a significant reduction in the average emission rate. So look at the advancements that have occurred here. This is again a snapshot from your latest economic survey. This is page 226 of latest economic survey. They say that increasing installed electricity generation capacity with the rising share of non-fossil fuel based capacity. So here in blue what you see is in this blue color you have this thermal. Yes, thermal is increasing as you start from 2014 to 15. Thermal is your energy coming from thermal power plants, coal, natural gas, all that. So yes, this is going up, but as you can see, these renewable energy sources in green and your nuclear and large hydroelectric power plants, these are also going up. These are also, their share is also increasing. So your installed capacity has already is already at 40%, and we can take it to 50% very well in time. So now, understanding the discussions involved. Now your updated NDCs are in place, nationally determined contributions are in place. But see, we are the most populous country of the world. If we are the most populous country, we are the biggest market of the world. India दुनिया की सबसे बड़ी markets में भी आता है क्योंकि यहाँ पर population सबसे ज़्यादा है. And if population is so much, you require infrastructure also, you require industries also, you require jobs, and hence your country will be producing a lot of pollution. आपके जो emissions होंगे वो बहुत ज़्यादा होंगे as compared to developed countries जिनका infrastructure setup है already. And basically these are rich nations. They do not have a lot of population also, so their emissions are obviously going to be lower. इनके लिए decrease करना emissions बहुत ज़्यादा आसान है as compared to a country like India, which needs to pull its people, pull its population out of poverty, which needs to fight this, these all social issues of, there are so many issues that are going on around. So we have to basically lead towards a way जहाँ पर development actually leads to emancipation of various classes of society. So that has to happen, and that can only happen when you have a lot of development going on, and that will inadvertently, it will release a lot of greenhouse gases, or carbon dioxide emissions will go up. So yes, what are the discussions involved here? The first one is carbon intensity. Carbon intensity, or I would say that let's clarify this concept. India का जो target है that we have to decrease our emission intensity by 45% of GDP to 2005 level, to reduce emission intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030 from 2005 level. Now this emission intensity, it is not that you have to reduce the total emissions by 45%. No. Everybody understands, and India also understands, that as your population is growing, GDP will also grow. You have to push your GDP ahead. So whatever जो 1% GDP के increase से 2005 में आप emissions release कर रहे थे, to increase GDP, more development has to happen, and hence more emissions go out in the atmosphere. So whatever emissions you were causing or your country was causing in 2005 by increasing GDP by 1%, now that emission will be reduced by 45%. So let's say I'll use this part, in 2005 for 1% increase in GDP, let's say your emissions were 100. Let's say 100 units आप emissions release कर रहे थे. Now till 2030 what you have to do, if you increase your GDP by 1%, so your emission intensity, it has to go down by 45%, that is 100 minus 45. These many emissions you can release, that is your 55 units of emissions they can be released. And this is the target for India, that whatever emissions we were releasing as a percentage of GDP in 2005, we will be bringing it down by 45%. So yes, that is your target that we have, and that is your emission intensity. It is not cumulative emissions or actual emissions, so keep a note of that. So yes, your total emissions, they will be rising, and that goes without saying. India is a developing nation, but all the countries in the past also, they have taken this approach. For example, China has taken this approach, and your major developed countries, they also took this approach whenever they were adhering to some climate change targets. So yes, that is your carbon intensity. That is the second one is definition of non-fossil fuel based energy resources. Now till 2021 आपका जो 25 megawatt hydroelectric power plants, if your hydroelectric power plants, that is your dams, if it is producing electricity of 25 megawatt or below that, then it was considered renewable energy, because such kind of dam or such kind of hydroelectric power plant, it will not induce earthquakes, harm the local biodiversity and a number of factors. But what happened in December 2021, the definition of non-fossil energy was clarified to include large hydropower, that is beyond 25 megawatt also, that will be included in your hydropower. It included nuclear energy also. आपके जो nuclear power plants है, it is a non-conventional source of energy, but it is not considered renewables. So yes, so India's basically as soon as we included all of these in non-fossil energy, जैसे ही आपकी large hydro power plants or nuclear energy was included in non-fossil energy, so your target of achieving your earlier it was 40%, so your 40% target of achieving electric power installed capacity from non-fossil energy, that was achieved back in 2021 or 2022 itself. So now this has been updated to 50%, increasing this 10%, that we'll have to see. And what the government is saying, that this will depend on the availability of international climate finance, and as we saw, technology transfer as well. So yeah, as of June 2022, renewables made up to renewable sources of energy which do not include nuclear or large hydropower, they made up just 28.3% of India's installed power capacity. Your hydro or large hydro, they made up 11.6%, and nuclear is 1.7%, for a non-fossil total of, if you add all of these, then they make up 41.6%. That means your 40% target has already been achieved. But actually renewables here, these are all non-fossil based installed energy, but actually renewables, they make up just 28.3%. And in terms of actual energy generation, the non-fossil share is very much low. In the coal, gas and oil, they account for 73.4% of India's power generation. That is huge, that is very big. With renewables, they account for just 13.6% of India's total energy generation, and hydropower 9.7%, nuclear 2.7%, for a non-fossil total of just 25.9%. So yes, in terms of installed power capacity, 40% target, that is our NDC, that has been achieved. But in terms of real actual generation, your power that is coming from non-fossil fuels, non-fossil energy, that is just 25.9%. Now the most important part here is of carbon sink. So India's target for its land and forestry sector, it remains unchanged from its first NDC. So since the target was unchanged, a lot of people were saying that India might not be able to achieve this target. So that's why they have not updated this or increased the limit. But that's not the case. Let's look at this. See, every year your forest cover is increasing. आपका जो tree cover या forest cover है, जो आपकी ISFR report आती है, India State of Forestry Report, that is released by Forest Survey of India. It says that every year your forest cover is increasing, and India का target क्या है according to the National Forest Policy? Our target is to have forest cover that is 1/4, that is 33%. 33% forest cover is the target of India, and India is every year increasing that. So if your forest cover is increasing naturally on because of the forest policy that you have in place, then obviously your carbon sink is also increasing because forest cover is going up. So if carbon sink is increasing, so this naturally, look at this carbon stock that you have. This is carbon stock in forest and carbon stock in tree cover. So every year starting from 2015, look at 2021, 7044 to 7204, here 963 to 996. So basically both of these sinks in forest and trees, carbon sinks are naturally increasing. So here also total carbon stock, this is increasing with time. It has from 29.38 billion tons in 2015 to 30.09 tons in 2021. So it is naturally increasing. Now the problem here was Forest Survey of India, they published a separate report. They questioned Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change and said that what do you mean by this additional forest, additional carbon sink that you will be generating, since your carbon sink is naturally going up. So term additional, that appears twice in India's forest goal, and lack of clear base air to measure emissions reductions. Let me take you back to this carbon, this is the target here. The target says, the NDC says, to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forest cover. So additional carbon sink will be created and additional forest and tree cover would be created. Now this is not very clear. First of all, you do not have a base year. If you are trying to increase your forest cover, you need to say what is the base year. Base year could be 2005, it could be 2020. That in comparison to which year are you going to increase your forest cover or tree cover. And your carbon sink, what do you mean by additional carbon sink? Because to have an additional carbon sink that you are getting naturally that is happening because your forest cover is increasing. To have this additional carbon sink, you need to have more tree plantation, you need to have more and more forest, and that is not clear at the international level also. The base year is not clear, this additional carbon sink part is not clear, and not just this, it is not clear to Forest Survey of India as well till date. So yes, this is something, this target, no matter if you put some efforts towards this or not, if we are talking about the natural target here, it will be achieved because India's forest cover is increasing and carbon stock is increasing every year. So that will be achieved. But if this target means something else, for example, your base year is, base year is of the previous century when there was a lot of carbon sink, then this might not be achieved, and that is the issue here, and that is the topic of our discussion here, that how is India actually achieving its carbon sink targets under your updated NDCs. So yes, India's nationally determined contributions meeting India's carbon sink targets. So yes, this video has been a long one, but this was important to understand that what are the issues involved there, what are the discussions involved there. Understanding things in chronology is very important. So I hope that this this added to your knowledge and this helps you out in your civil services journey. Stay tuned to the channel. We are launching a lot of videos with regards for your prelims preparation and mains preparation on a daily basis. Stay tuned. All the very best.